Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Jeff Mackler, to discuss the war in Ukraine. Jeff Mackler is a founder and administrative committee member of the United National Antiwar Coalition, a graduate of Antioch College in Ohio. He's a longtime teacher and union activist with the American Federation of Teachers in California. He helped found the Northern California Climate Mobilization and is director of the Free Mumia Abu Jamal Mobilization. He's also a leader in social action, which promotes anti-war movements, civil rights actions, and Latin American solidarity campaigns, and runs candidates for public office. Jeff writes widely for several progressive magazines and media outlets. Most recently, he published Brick's Block, a No Alternative to the U.S. Order in Socialist Action, The Myth of Free Speech America in Counterpunch, and The Crisis in Ukraine, a major challenge to the U.S. anti-war movement, for the Los Angeles Progressive. Welcome, Mr. Mackler.
Glad to be with you, Dr. Artz.
I'd like to start with you explaining to our viewers what is the United National Antiwar Coalition. I'm aware they have actions in New York, Chicago. I've seen things from the West Coast, but could you tell me how it's organized, what it consists of?
We were formed about 10 years ago through a national anti-war conference in Albany, New York, and 700 people from across the country participated. Today we have 110, maybe 120 affiliate groups, and our basic objective is to say no to U.S. wars at home and abroad, money for human needs, not war. So we do periodic coordinated national demonstrations is our main thing. We have educational conferences. We organize national speaking tours. We brought Malalai Joya from Afghanistan touring the United States. She was a member of the Afghan parliament, a dissident. So we're you might call a United Front National Anti-War Coalition. The component organizations have different views on a whole series of questions. We don't all agree on how to characterize Russia or China or this or that, but we have one common point. We are against spending $1 trillion a year on U.S. wars at home and abroad.
And those 120 affiliates coordinate actions and work together, as you said, united against war. So.
Exactly.
One of the things you said was you're in opposition to all U.S. wars and interventions, and the likely question would be only U.S. wars? You're not opposed to other wars? I mean, it's a trick question, but...
Well, I know it's a trick question, but it has an interesting answer. The United States has 1,100 military bases in 110 countries. That's more than the whole world combined. It has the largest military budget of over $1 trillion, and that's not counting the CIA. And that is more than the top 10 nations in the world. Russia, in comparison, the country you asked, has 6 military bases outside of its borders, mostly in the former Soviet Union. And China, another major U.S. competitor, has exactly 1 in Djibouti at the Horn of Africa, where there are also Japanese and American bases. So it's not quite an equal question. It conjures up the idea that the Russians are always making war. In my personal opinion, I'm against the interventions of Russia in Chechnya, and I'm against the attack on civil liberties and democratic rights at home. I think that Russia is a capitalist country. Tragically, capitalism has been restored under a bureaucratic leadership. But I make a distinction with regard to Ukraine or Syria on how we evaluate Russia. We don't paint everyone with the same brush.
So you said you have a disagreement with Russia's actions in Chechnya. But what about the invasion of, some people call it an invasion, Russia calls it
some kind of military action.
Yeah, some military action.
Right.
So is that
UNAC is not opposed to the Russian invasion a couple of years ago, a year and a half or so ago. So when the Russians finally intervened, it was a very interesting moment. On the one hand, Ukraine, with the help of the United States, on its border had established a military post which had initially 45,000 U.S. trained soldiers from the major NATO countries. By 2021, when the Russians invaded, the U.S. trained NATO forces massed on the Russian border to the tune of 280,000 members. So everybody thought Ukraine, after 10 years, was going to invade. And in fact, riding around the streets of Oakland and Berkeley, where I live, kept hearing President Biden on the radio saying, we have information that the Russians are going to invade. Well, the Russians did invade. They didn't like the idea of 280,000 marching on the Donbass to kill tens of thousands of innocent Russian-speaking people whose language rights had been denied.
So in the midst of that, it sounds like, because one of the arguments was this was a Russian invasion that was unprovoked, but you're suggesting that from 2014 on, up until 21-22, there was U.S. interest in antagonizing this crisis, arming, instigating, participating, and also the question is often been debated in the press and in among anti-war groups if Russia was unprovoked, or was this the consequence of NATO continuing to expand? Because, I mean, even Henry Kissinger said it's a mistake to continue to expand NATO, but Clinton did it back in the 90s, and since then, I don't know how many the total countries is. There must be 30 countries now in NATO, but they just kept being added, and they kept getting closer and closer and closer to the Russian border, and Kissinger says, you can't do this, you're going to basically provoke. So rather than saying unprovoked, Kissinger's saying it is provoked. Are you agreeing with Kissinger at this point?
Yeah. Well, John Mearsheimer, Noam Chomsky, and Kissinger, and a whole host of people have said that. Everybody knows what happened in the Maidan Square. Everybody knows that the fascists started a coup and took over a government. That's illegal by U.S. standards. There are two factors that you raised that I want to comment on. The first is the Russians have some justification for having nuclear weapons on their border. And that is, if NATO was literally there, the nuclear missiles from the United States, NATO countries, would be 5 minutes from Moscow. That's a threat. And they're concerned about that. As you know, the Russians are experienced with war and fascism. During World War II, they lost 27 million people, just about more than the entire world combined, when 80–90% of the fascist Hitler army was inside Russia invading. So they don't have any great love. Secondly, the Ukrainian people didn't like the idea that their fellow Russians, and before Ukraine officially became part of Russia, several years earlier, they were just one country. So many Russian-speaking Russians had Russian-speaking Ukrainian friends and family and relatives. 700,000 Russian-speaking Ukrainians fled when the United States-backed coup government started to attack. The second is
they fled to Russia.
They fled to Russia,
which I think is kind of ironic, because you're saying, well, Russia's invaded Ukraine, and now Ukraine's up in arms. But at the time, you said 700,000. I think the number's up now to 2 million people have fled to Russia.
Exactly.
So why would you flee to a place that you think is invading your country?
You know, the Russians have a polling agency called Levada. And it is considered by New York Times calls it an independent, legitimate polling agency. And they said that 86% of the Russian population supported Putin, because basically they were accepting their own people back in their own country who were being murdered. As I said, 14,000 were murdered by the coup government.
It makes me think a little mind game, essentially. I mean, what would happen if Russia had troops in Tijuana or in Toronto? What would be the response of the United States? I mean, I know they did have in Cuba with the missiles for a while, but everybody panicked and the U.S. rushed to the negotiating table. And I mean, when you think about this as, like you said, 5 minutes from Moscow, there's going to be some provocation in that, as if Russian troops or tanks or missiles are in Tijuana or Toronto or Havana, the U.S. would respond I don't know how they would respond, but they certainly wouldn't respond largely differently than Russia responded.
Exactly. I agree entirely. I think that there's another point that I should make about why the Russians were concerned. By the way, the Russians tried like heck to negotiate a settlement. They secured the support of France and Germany in negotiations with the Ukrainian government and Russia in Istanbul, observed by the Turkish government, and they signed accords to end the war. This is a couple of years into it, after 2014. They were called the Minsk I and II protocols. And those protocols basically said that the borders of Ukraine from Russia to the west would stay the same. They'd establish a federated constitutional government. The people in the east could maintain the states they had in Donbass and Luhansk, and control the resources as they had previously done. I got to say, it was a fight over resources too, because the different ex-Communist Party Stalinist bureaucrats who used to run Ukraine and were now the nation's leading capitalists had some differences over who was going to control the shale. But one point I want to make that is absolutely critical, and that is, all of a sudden, about a year or so ago, mysterious event happened. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were obliterated. That was the main source that Russia had going through Ukraine to, in partnership with Germany, to supply a majority of the fossil fuels to Western Europe, especially Germany, who is heavily dependent. So they helped the Russians build this pipeline. That pipeline blew up, and the United States said, well, my gosh, I have no idea who did that. They conducted a huge investigation and at first blamed people from Norway. People from Poland said it was likely the Ukrainian government. But Seymour Hersh, who was the Pulitzer Prize journalist formerly of the New York Times, who did the expose during the Vietnam War.
My Lai.
Yeah, the My Lai massacre. Yeah. Seymour Hersh did an extremely detailed report and demonstrated that the United States was responsible for obliterating this pipeline. Why? Because the United States in 2014, for the first time in the modern era, became a net exporter of fossil fuels because of fracking. And the United States had a massive surplus of liquefied natural gas that they wanted to ship to Ukraine and Europe. But why do it when the price of the American liquid natural gas is double the Russians? So you just take out the Russian pipeline and then say, we're the only supplier. So it was $1 trillion gambit, in my opinion. And it's going on to this day. We just saw an article on the coup in Niger. Well, Niger is part of a Nigerian pipeline that starts out on the west of Africa, goes through Niger and north to Europe to supply fossil fuel. And that fossil fuel is going to be pumped in by American corporations. So if you're working for ExxonMobil and you see an opportunity to capture one of the largest markets in the world, that is the market of Western Europe, you will think you'll take that quite seriously. That's my opinion, the central reason. A multi-trillion-dollar oil war.
Well, the other thing several commentators have made the point is that as the Ukraine war goes on, the $118 billion that the U.S. has provided to the Ukraine and the contributions of all the countries of Europe to the war in Ukraine requires the production of lots of ammunition, lots of military equipment, lots of tanks, armaments, other things. And there's also somebody that's going to make a boatload of money off of producing and selling those armaments and military equipment. So my question is, this is not Exxon, and this is not McDonnell Douglas, this is not Northrop Grumman or Shell Oil, it's the U.S. government. And the question is how does the U.S. government, or how do the politicians explain this to the American people other than saying it's in our national interest? Even though Northrop Grumman or Boeing or Exxon or somebody else is due to make a big profit, it's presented to us as if it's in our national interest.
Tragically, these days, what we hear from the government everywhere is that war is in our national interest, usually to preserve democracy somewhere.
Yeah.
So we overthrow one government after another and assassinate their leaders or organize coups. And it's all in the interest of democracy. But the reality is, in every one of these countries, like the coup in Bolivia a couple of years ago, the Bolivians signed contracts with the Chinese for lithium extraction. They have one of the largest sources in the world. The United States didn't like the contract, backed a military coup, threw the government of Evo Morales out. The same thing with Venezuela. Venezuela and Iran, the two arch enemies of the United States today, just by coincidence happen to be the world's largest fossil fuel reserve countries. And they and the United States traditionally owned that fossil fuel. In 1953, the United States organized a coup that overthrew the elected government of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. And when Alan Greenspan, who was the Federal Reserve, wrote his biography, a 1,000-page book, U.S. Federal Reserve, they said, but how can you explain, Alan, why the United States overthrew the elected government, democratic government, which had nationalized the oil that used to be British, in Iran? And Greenspan was very frank. You know, he's an old guy, and he wrote his autobiography, and he said, well, the 800-pound gorilla in the room was that they had the largest oil reserves in the world, and we couldn't let that be. We, in the United States, in our national security interests, need to control that. Same with Venezuela. They have the second largest oil reserves. That's why the United States organized a coup, replaced the president of the country with a guy named Juan Guaido, basically represented nothing. And they sought control of the massive Venezuelan oil resources. And when the Venezuelans said you can't do that, the United States organized sanctions against Venezuela that had the effect, according to the United Nations, killing 50,000 people from starvation, hunger, and disease.
So let's go back to the other observation, or the explanation you were giving, is that the U.S. does this under the rubric of defending democracy or advancing democracy. I just wonder if you would like to share some insights into the extent of democracy in the Ukraine now.
Even the New York Times, which is a major source of my information, constantly reports that corruption is rampant. Trade unions are virtually banned, free speech is banned. They banned the Russian language for a while, and the Ukrainian government literally ordered the Ukrainian army to march on the east, the Donbass and Crimea. And what happened, which is very instructive, is that the entire Ukrainian army that was ordered to march in that direction resigned and joined the Russian army. And the same with Crimea, where something like 75–80% of the people are Russian-speaking. So it's not like this is a great government. Even the United States top people say, yes, we're trying to deal with corruption. The corruption, though, is excused on the grounds that we're at war. And when you're at war, you can do anything bad and evil, including orchestrating a fascist-led coup that replaces the entire leadership of the country, throws out the elected government, basically abolishes the parliament, and puts the power in the hands of the most notorious, hated, right-wing neo-fascist groups.
And I understand that Russian is still, newspapers have to print in Ukrainian, not Russian.
Yeah.
And they don't allow Russian in civil service and education and healthcare and the rest. So you said it was temporary, but it seems like it still exists today, which is a strange, strange rubric to say we're defending democracy after all of these things happen. So,
well, that's because of one simple fact, and that is the United States' concern for democracy is subordinate to the multi-billion and trillion-dollar interests of the military-industrial complex and the oil. When they took Rex Tillerson, who was the head of ExxonMobil, they made him Trump's Secretary of State. And he went to the Middle East to make sure that U.S. oil interests were there. We invaded Iraq, which President Biden says is a mistake that killed 1 million Iraqis. But we did that because we wanted control of Iraqi's oil.
Well, I don't know if we did, not you and I, but okay, I get the point.
Well, basically, Iraq had signed contracts for the exportation, for the, exploration of Iraqi oil with British companies, Russian companies, and others. And the United States said, when they invaded, one, they eliminated the Iraqi government entirely, appointed their own, I forgot his name, Paul something or other, their own head of state, rewrote all the contracts to the advantage of the American oil corporations.
So we understand the war in Ukraine has taken 500,000 lives and displaced 6 or 8 million people, but it's also had some larger consequence for the rest of the world. The production of grain and the export of grain has been restricted because of the war. That means that it means that it's affecting food and the supply of nutrition, especially to Africa, but I imagine to other parts of the world as well. So it's not like the war in Ukraine is limited to the war in Ukraine. There's global ramifications of this.
Exactly. Ukraine used to be called the breadbasket of Europe. It has rich agricultural areas, as does Syria, by the way, and Syria also has oil. And Ukraine also has the 4th largest fossil fuel fracking shale reserves in the world. And they're in the east. The United States is interested in both of those sectors. They want the Ukrainian shale, because they're expert on fracking, and they want control of the grain, which they think that this, quote, democratic government will grant American corporations rather than Russian corporations. It did create a food crisis around the world, which the Russians, according to Putin's speech in his representative Lavrov's speech in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, the Russians are sending food, if not free food, to Africa, which is largely dependent on food supplies from Europe. So it's no doubt, it created deep dissatisfaction. In my view, the majority of the people in Europe, not the governments, oppose the U.S. war and NATO. They know what the war machine is like.
There's a good question because, we paint this picture of the war in Ukraine. It seems disastrous. It seems hopeless. It seems like there's no way to go forward. Like, I know negotiations were interfered with when Turkey put together negotiations between Zelensky and Putin, and Boris Johnson said, no, you can't do this. The U.S. says, no, you can't do this. But at the same time, I think a point you made earlier was there's an increasing number of Americans that do not continue to support the war in Ukraine. And I've read things in the New York Times and other papers that the same thing is happening in France and Germany and Czechoslovakia, that there's less and less support for that war to continue, which would seem like that gives us some hope for a different attitude towards the existing war.
Exactly. For the first time, the New York Times cited several polls this past week or so saying that the majority of the American people are against additional aid to Ukraine. I think it's now $180 billion. They couldn't pass a bill last week in Congress to send money to Ukraine because the truth about it is coming out. It's also a political football, no doubt. And there is dissension in the United States in the same way that there's dissension regarding the public official line of the Israeli government to slaughter Palestinians in Gaza. Their demonstrations are unprecedented in world history this past week or two. Tens of millions of people, 300,000 in London, 3 million in Yemen, 9,000 or 7,000 in Chicago, which is not, just an hour from here.
Yeah.
So people do not like the idea of innocent people being slaughtered anywhere. They don't like the idea of the government spending tens of billions in the United States, trillions of dollars on war when there are so many social needs at home that need addressing.
That's a good place for us to end. Putting human needs before profits of certain corporations. That's all the time we have today for our program. I want to thank Jeff Mackler for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.